Hello, I'm Robert Kramer. I'm a professor of Middle East History at St. Norberts College in De Pere, Wisconsin. And I'm speaking to you today from the international meeting of the Sudan Studies Association in Bergen, Norway. And I've been asked to talk a little bit about my particular interest in the Sudan, specifically the situation of non-Muslims in a militant Islamic society. I've done research and written about a period of Sudanese history that is known as the Mahdiyya. This is a time in the 1880s and 1890s when there was an extremely militant Islamic regime in power in Sudan, what we would today call an Islamist regime. And my work has, among other things, focused on the situation for non-Muslims in a militant Islamic state. So I want to say a little bit about that situation. It's obviously relevant today because of the nature of political Islam in the world and the rising number of, again, what we refer to as Islamist movements. Now, what I have found in my own research is that a number of things tend to happen. Again, referring to the situation of the Sudanese Mahdiyya in the 1880s and 1890s. First, there is a situation of very highly inflamed rhetoric. And by this I mean religious doctrine having to do with the nature of being a Muslim or a non-Muslim in an Islamic state. In the situation of the Mahdi, what we saw happening was a brief but very intensive period of harsh laws being enacted that defined who was a Muslim and who was not a Muslim, and imposed some fairly restrictive rules on people who are not Muslims. This was all done by the Mahdi himself, the ruler of the state, and he made reference to the Muslim holy book, the Quran, and to the Sunnah, or practices and oral teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. And using Quran and Sunnah, the Mahdi judged that non-Muslims should live in a particular way, and there were a number of restrictions placed upon them. Many of these restrictions do come directly out of mainstream Islamic teaching. Many of them were also Islamic teachings that were interpreted through the lens of the Mahdi's own puritanical ideas. And the reason for this paradox or problem is that Islam has a number of things to say, of course, on Muslims and non-Muslims. And when one refers to the Quran or to the Sunnah, the practices and teachings of Muhammad, one finds that there are a number of sometimes quite contradictory statements, and invariably it's a matter of who is interpreting the religious texts and to what end. So in the Sudan, in the last 15 years of the 19th century, we have a militant Islamic state. We have a leader known as the Mahdi who is interpreting Islam in an extremely narrow and rigorous and, again, I would say puritanical way, with some fairly harsh and restrictive rulings regarding the nature of non-Muslims. Now, this also extends to matters of living space, where people can settle, how they can dress. In the case of the Mahdi, non-Muslims were in fact compelled to become Muslims, compelled to convert to Islam. They were compelled to marry Sudanese women. There were a number of things that were done that made life very difficult for the non-Muslim community. The people that I'm talking about here, when I refer to non-Muslims, were a collection of different communities. They consisted of Syrians and Greeks and Armenians, Egyptian Coptic Christians, Jews, a variety of communities from the Mediterranean area in general. Now, again, the situation we see is that some very harsh, restrictive rules are being introduced regarding a variety of things, including settlement, clothing, practice, trade practices, marriage patterns, and things like this. Now, what I find interesting is that beyond the level of the rhetoric, the religious and political rhetoric, certain very interesting realities emerge. And in the case of the Mahdi, it emerged in a very short period of time, within a matter of maybe 5 years. We see that as conditions change, as they invariably do, economic and political conditions, and sometimes environmental conditions which promote or enforce certain kinds of changes or necessitate certain kinds of changes. We see that a number of these rules are relaxed, and this is not so surprising, I suppose, but a lot of the very restrictive rulings that the Mahdi and his successor, the Khalifa Abdullahi, introduced were relaxed. This was never formally recognized. The formal doctrine of the Mahdiyya continued unchanged from the beginning of the period in 1881 until the very end in 1898. However, what we see happening in actual practice is a number of the non-Muslim communities are in fact settling around the capital area, Omdurman and Khartoum, in a variety of locations. They're not necessarily restricted to where they're supposed to be living. These same individuals tend to intermarry broadly among Sudanese and non-Sudanese peoples, creating very large extended families. The need for trade, and I don't just mean domestic trade, but foreign trade, also necessitates a more relaxed approach to the behavior of non-Muslims, because many of these people, Greeks and Armenians and Jews and Syrians, were very active merchants conducting trade, particularly with Egypt to the north and the east, along the Red Sea and along the Nile. And what happened in the case of the Sudanese Mahdiyya, again a very militant, puritanical Islamic state, is that in a very short period of time, many of these same non-Muslims who were initially held to very restricted kinds of lives were given a fairly broad range to undertake their business and conduct their lives. Moreover, we find that the importance of a number of these non-Muslims in trade also leads to greater participation in political affairs. We see the Khalifa, who ruled the Mahdi state for many years, consulting with a number of these people and soliciting their opinions on trade matters and other matters. In other words, recognizing their indispensable role in the economy of the Sudan. Within the social world of this very Islamist society, we see these same non-Muslims who are at least superficially Muslim now maintaining very strong ties with fellow Christians or Jews and having very close relationships with Muslims as well through intermarriage. I think a very important lesson that emerges is the way in which identities are negotiated. In other words, rather than the kind of distinct and doctrinaire labels that are imposed on people, in fact, we find that a number of these individuals and families who are Christian and Jewish tend to have fairly fluid forms of identity. In other words, they can adapt to changing conditions very deftly, and their importance to the state is recognized, and this, I think, allows them to move in and out of circles of power. Ideas about religion and about national identity tend to be very flexible as well. And along with what we call flexible or negotiated identities among these people, we also see syncretism, that is, a joining together of different cultural and religious practices and ideas. Again, even within the midst of a very rigorous and puritanical Islamist state. And we find that the effects of culture and class are very pronounced. Ultimately, what we end up with are not the very simple and cut and dry communities that history books talk about, Muslims and non-Muslims, for instance, but rather gatherings of smaller communities that move in and out of the categories that are formally imposed upon them. There are a number of Sudanese families, for instance, that are extremely interesting along these lines. These are families that encompass not one and not two, but sometimes three religions within one extended family. They're also families that can encompass a variety of tribal or ethnic groups. People in these families tend to have very flexible notions of their identity. All of this, again, happening during a time of very militant Islamic rule, a time when presumably people's lives are very constrained and their beliefs are dictated and their behaviors are predetermined. So for me, what's interesting about studying religious minorities in Islamic State is the way in which conditions, again over a very short period of time, necessitate more practical arrangements than one would assume from reading the religious speeches and teachings and doctrines of the rulers of the state. There were maybe a couple of dozen Jewish families that had come from various parts of the Mediterranean world. And it's interesting to see the ways in which these Jewish families survived this period, and not only survived, but many of them flourished. A number of families I have found, though they did convert to Islam, because of course they were compelled to do so by the Mahdi, retained secretly their Jewish religion. Others, however, did not, and became Muslims profoundly, and remained Muslims after the period of the Mahdi was over in 1898. Within these two groups, the Jews who became Muslims and then reverted to Judaism after 1898, and those Jews who became Muslims and remained Muslims after 1898, they continued to be very close socially. Both groups also enjoyed very close ties to the larger Muslim community within which they lived. In at least 3 of the Jewish families that I've studied, we also find some very interesting examples of intermarriage, where one presumably Jewish family also includes Muslim and Christian relatives, all of whom are wholly considered part of the family. In a number of cases, these same multi-religious families also include a number of specific Sudanese ethnicities. That is, Sudanese individuals from various parts of the Sudan, again, all of whom are considered part of the family itself. One would be tempted to think that these examples are aberrations, that these are perhaps unusually broad-minded and liberal individuals. In fact, my own research suggests that, again, this is more common than one would ordinarily suspect, that, again, in a context of political turmoil and economic and social change, that identities tend to be fairly fluid, and that families and indeed communities are formed that can and do encompass a number of different religious and ethnic backgrounds. And I've seen this in some very interesting ways within the Sudanese Jewish community in the 1880s and 1890s. And it remains to be seen how the lessons of the history of the Sudan can apply to the situation of militant Islam in the world today. But I think it's interesting to bear in mind that when thinking about conditions for people in an Islamic State, we have to look beyond religious doctrine and formal rulings and consider matters of class and culture and historical precedent and the ways in which economic necessity and environmental conditions and a variety of other factors shape the way people behave and the way people identify themselves. Thank you very much.